If you can hear me right now, go ahead and type in the chat and let us know that the sound is coming through okay. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about Colorado's new academic standards. I think there's a lot of exciting things to talk about in the world of environmental education and water education as related to the new standards. So I am excited to dive in today. This is Katie Navin from the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education, and I am here with...
This is Jayla Poppleton with Water Education Colorado.
And we're excited to work together on this webinar today to explore the new standards. So our goals for today are basically to provide the basics on how to navigate the Colorado academic standards and some of the language that's used in them, to explore some of the big changes particularly in the science standards because of the integration of the next generation science standards, and to use some water education examples to identify some tools that you can use to help correlate your programs and lessons. We only have an hour today, so we're just going to be skimming the surface, but hopefully this will give you some tools, and you can always follow up with this later for more information or with questions. So on the webinar today, everyone is muted, so if you have questions, please type those into the chat. And we'll stop a couple times and make sure we answer those. And if we don't get to them while we're on the webinar today, I can follow up after the webinar and send out answers to any questions that didn't get answered, or find answers to the ones that I don't know the answers to. So please use that function and ask as many questions as you have. All right, we'll get started by just talking a little bit about the Water Education Colorado.
Great, so we are just so excited to partner with CAE on this webinar today. The work that we do is focused on promoting a better understanding of Colorado's water resources at a statewide level, and we do that through providing balanced and accurate information, education, and leadership programs. So we're really working toward fostering a deeper awareness and understanding of water, its management, and the challenges that we face in Colorado, more engagement among community members and students and citizens, and informed decision-making at the state and community level. And we provide a wide variety of resources and training opportunities, and we do outreach work and have some leadership programs in order to go about fulfilling our mission. One of the programs that we offer that pertains to this group today is our Water Educator Network, which supports and connects Colorado's education and outreach professionals that are dedicated to advancing understanding about water. And so we have a great nexus with CAE on that focus. And so this slide shows a couple photos of some of the workshops and trainings in action with folks in that network. That can include professionals across the state, from professors to researchers, formal teachers, local government employees, water utility professionals, and nonprofit outreach coordinators, all who are working to enhance the amount, quality, and effectiveness of water education throughout Colorado. So our goal is really to equip those educators with trainings and tools and professional development opportunities. And today is just a really great way to talk about where we can integrate with the goals that our formal educators have in the classroom. This is just another slide to show some of our programs in action, our tours, workshops. Our website is a great resource, and we have other publications and resources for educators to take and use with their audiences. So please don't be shy. Check out the offerings that we have available after today's webinar.
Great, thanks, Jayla. And if you don't know the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education, we are a network of about 850 or so environmental educators across the state who are all working to advance environmental literacy. We offer programs that help with professional development, that help foster support for environmental education and collaboration within the field. So if you have any questions about the environmental education field in Colorado, please feel free to reach out to us and we are happy to help. But with that, let's jump into standards. Oh, one more acknowledgement before we get started. Endeavor has generously sponsored our webinars this year and has been so helpful in bringing this content to all of you. So thank you to them. All right, so standards. Many of you are probably familiar with the current standards that we have. In case standards are brand new to you, we'll go over a little bit about how Colorado organizes them. But in general, they're the learning goals for what students should know and be able to do. There are 4 sets of standards that you will hear people talk about, so I just want to go over those briefly. The Common Core standards, which we hear a lot about politically, are national standards in English language arts and math. So that's a national set of standards. The Next Generation Science standards are also national standards that many states have adopted, and those are in the content area of science. Then there are the Guidelines for Excellence in Environmental Education, and many of you may or may not be familiar with these, but these are our standards within the field of environmental education, which includes water education, and are a helpful tool for looking at our standards to see what's in there and what's not, and what we want to make sure that we're covering in our programming so that we're meeting the goals that we are setting out to make. So we'll talk a little bit more about those today. The Colorado academic standards are the ones you're probably going to focus on the most because that's what teachers in Colorado are accountable to. What's important to note is that the Common Core standards, which are, again, English language arts and math, have been correlated and integrated into the Colorado academic standards. So there are many similar elements between those. In the same way, with this new iteration of standards that was adopted this summer by the State Board of Education, the Next Generation Science standards were largely incorporated into our new science standards. And so that's going to play a lot into how implementation of these new standards go. One more important piece to remember is that in Colorado, each district is required to meet or exceed Colorado's academic standards. So that does mean that districts can choose to adopt the Common Core standards directly or the Next Generation Science standards directly. As long as the standards that they have to exceed or meet what Colorado has set forth, they can make changes to those. So if you are working with a lot of districts, a lot of different districts, you will probably want to focus on the Colorado academic standards. If your programming and your focus is really only in one school district, you might want to get their standards documents and look at those because there might be slight changes that they make. So just a little bit about the timeline. One important thing to know is that we have some time before these standards go into effect. And districts have this year and next year to really think about how they're transitioning into using them. So the 2018-2019 school year and the 2019-2020 school year are all dedicated to transition. School districts are expected to implement these in the fall of 2020, and state assessments are expected to reflect these revisions in 2021. I will say, though, there is a survey out right now about whether school districts can meet those deadlines, and so that timeline may be pushed out even further. Again, we have 178 school districts in Colorado, so they'll all be on a slightly different timeline and when they fully make the switch. But in general, we're looking at 2020. So let's look at what the standards look like. If you open them up, right here I have a social studies standard, just to get you familiar with all of the content that is included in here, and there's a lot. You can see there's a lot of information on this slide. The box you see at the top where it says social studies is the content area. Then you have the grade that the standard is in, and then you have the actual standard. And in Colorado, standards are buckets. So in social studies, history is a standard, geography is a standard, economics is a standard, and civics is a standard. So that language might be a little bit different than how you're used to thinking about it. What you see next on the slide is a prepared graduate competency. And this is a statement that reflects what students should know and be able to do by the time they graduate. So oftentimes this statement seems really difficult compared to the content below because you're looking at a graduation level competency versus what they're doing in first grade. But anything on this page for this standard is building up to what that content is. The grade level expectation is probably the place you're going to focus the most, and that is the specific content and skills that a student needs to know and be able to do. So in this case, it's describe the characteristics of a community and how they are influenced by the environment. Most of the time, that's where programs are correlating their programs to, and what they're looking at when they're kind of doing a quick glance at the standard. But there's a lot more information in here. You can also see below on that standard, there's a box called evidence outcomes. This box is really important for teachers in the classroom. This is what the assessment questions are going to be based on, and these statements all reflect what it looks like when students have mastered that grade level expectation. So that can give you a lot more information about what that grade level expectation really means, and what students are going to be expected to do. So in terms of unpacking the standards, that's a great place to look. In the next box you see highlighted, you're going to see Colorado essential skills. And Colorado has adopted 4 groupings of essential skills: personal skills, entrepreneurial skills, civic and interpersonal skills, and professional skills. And these are all things that the Department of Education expects to be built into all the work we're doing to meet those standards. So they'll be looking for different skill sets in the instruction when you're looking to master those standards. And if you look at these, there's some great places to implement water education and environmental education when you think about information literacy, critical thinking, problem solving. There's some really important skills in there that we can really capitalize on. So that's a great place to look as well. Next, you'll see a box for inquiry questions. And these are questions that students might answer and explore to get to that grade level expectation. So this is another place to look to unpack that. What questions could you be exploring in your program? With each iteration of the standards, I think there is a bigger and bigger expectation for that exploration, that critical thinking, that student exploration. So this is a great place to get an idea of what they were thinking there. The nature and skills of geography, or nature and skills of whatever discipline you are working in. It could be the nature and skills of history or the nature and skills of science, is how do geographic thinkers, or whatever subject you're in, think? What other skills and things do they need to apply in order to be successful at what they do? Again, this is just another place where you can unpack the standards and learn more about what that grade level expectation means. Finally, this is a brand new piece in the standards. We haven't seen it before, the disciplinary information and media literacy. There is a big connection in the new standards to how students demonstrate their learning through reading, writing, and communicating, and using those skills. And so this section kind of outlines what some of that might look like, and has some connections back to other content areas as well. So that's what the standards look like. So in social studies, I would say, which has a lot of connections to environmental and water education, particularly in geography, a lot of the content stayed the same. It might have shifted a little bit. There was a lot of clarification that happened, but science is where we're seeing some really big changes. And so if you're not familiar with NGSS, or the Next Generation Science Standards, and how those are incorporated, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about why those are different than standards in the past, because that's really going to impact both how you correlate your programs, but also if you want to tweak them to really be effectively meeting these standards. So Next Generation Science Standards are based on a three-pronged framework. So when you think of a standard or a grade level expectation, when you, they pack three things into that statement. One is a science and engineering practice. What are those skills? One is a cross-cutting concept. We'll talk more about that. And then finally, the third piece is the core idea, the concept that we normally think of when we think of standards, that knowledge piece. So science and engineering practices, what are those? Those are skills we use a lot. I think this fits really well with environmental and water education. Skills like asking questions, developing and using models, planning investigations, analyzing data, using mathematics, constructing explanations, and designing solutions, engaging in argument, and communicating information. These are things that are going to be repeated across grades. You're going to see them over and over and over again. And they're going to be embedded in every single grade level expectation. Cross-cutting concepts, again, are things that spiral throughout the standards, so you're going to see them over and over again. Are things like patterns, cause and effect, scale, systems, energy, structure, and stability and change. And you're gonna see those things, and the standards really try to, in whatever piece of content that they're teaching, connect one of these cross-cut or more of these cross-cutting concepts. So all three of those things put together make up the framework for the Next Generation Science Standards. And while that seems really well connected to what we already do in environmental education, I do think it requires a little bit of shift in how we're thinking and teaching. Next Generation Science Standards, and this is, I think, is really cool, particularly for the work we do, has a huge focus on natural phenomena. So these observable events, things that we as environmental and water educators can actually take people out to look at, observe, explore, and do. Really strong fit with our work. In terms of engineering, they're looking at how do we design solutions that arise with these natural phenomena to problems that occur. But the big shift and a really important piece about thinking about how natural phenomena really are the base for these standards is that it creates a shift from learning about a topic to figuring out why or how something happens. And that requires a little bit different thinking on our part in how we put our programs together. So we're going to see if this works here. On the next slide, I have a video that we are going to attempt to play, and hopefully this will work. It's a short video that shows what a classroom looks like when you've switched to this next generation science standards teaching model.
They can't be close to a while, but it helps. This small right here. I think the first thing that I would say about shifting to an NGSS-centric classroom is that designing three-dimensional experiences in a classroom is really hard. Like there's no two ways about it. It's difficult. There are definitely things that you can do that really start that domino flowing, that spark that desire to persist as a teacher. Everybody feel good? Ready? And that is to flip the way that you normally present information to students and give them an opportunity to explore and to construct some understanding before you do any explaining. So it must be like, I don't know if this is enough before. I don't think it works. What if we had something else here that is that? I think that that's one of the elements that's part of the spirit of the NGSS in our classroom, is that the students are really excited to explore something new because they know that we're going to end up having rich conversations and doing deep thinking around that context. We decided to compare the energy pyramid to the Rube Goldberg, because the energy is constantly transferring, whether it's from the producer to the consumer or to do the different steps of the Rube Goldberg. Do you want to show us an example of your steps, and then maybe an example within the pyramid? Right here, when the dominoes go up the Rube Goldberg and then the ball goes down, that's the energy transferring up and then down to hit the end of our Rube Goldberg. And through this part, we have the sunlight is transferring the energy into the plants, and then the other resources like the consumers, and then eventually the humans can use that energy. So the second part of that is, I think that NGSS-focused classroom students need to always be engaged in trying to explain a phenomenon or develop a solution to a problem. So I didn't scrap all of the great activities that I loved as a teacher for 20 years, but I thought about what storyline could I develop where there was something at the end that students were going to explain that they were excited about explaining, or a problem that they were going to solve, and then what tools do I have in my tool belt would really provide them with great evidence and that they could then develop that explanation down the road.
Now we can relate this to the law of conservation of energy when it transfers from gravitational potential energy up here down to kinetic. Energy is destroyed, but it is lost to systems such as sound and light.
I think it was thinking about my class as a story and creating that full picture for students, as opposed to what specific discrete piece of content are in. One of the things that really facilitates that is conversation with other educators. One of the things I love about the NGSS is that it's a national common language. So I can work with teachers from all over the United States and talk about these things. And I have done that. I'll start a storyline or I'll throw something out there, and then people will point me in directions of some really great experiences that would help students get to an understanding and be able to construct their experience.
Great. So hopefully you could hear that and see how I think traditionally we are really good at providing the hands-on exploring piece. But I think traditionally we provided content and then let students explore that content. And now what NGSS is asking us to do is have the explanation or the exploration first, have students explain what they think is happening, and then actually overlay the content on top of that. So really kind of flipping how traditionally that might have been taught. So not a huge shift, but definitely a shift that takes some thinking about. So the science standards, because of the integration of NGSS, do look a little bit different. So you'll see this looks very similar to the social studies standards. However, you'll see a couple different pieces. In that Colorado Essential Skills and piece down on the lower left-hand corner, it adds in those science and engineering practices, and they overlay those Colorado skills with those science and engineering practices. There on the lower right-hand corner, there is a section specifically for those cross-cutting concepts. And then above, you'll see a section called Elaboration on the GLE. And that contains two things: inquiry questions. You can see the first one is a question. And then it also includes direct connections and citations to the core concepts in NGSS. So you can see exactly where that correlates. And a grade level expectation might connect to more than one piece or more than one different core concept from NGSS. So there's a lot in here to help you unpack and understand how to help students master that grade level expectation. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of thinking about what some of those shifts for NGSS might look like. I'm going to stop right here for just a sec and check and see if we have any questions.
So we did have a question about whether we could send out the link to the video because it wasn't completely clear, and you might like to watch it again, so we will absolutely do that. And we also received a question about whether these slides would be available after the webinar, and we will be sharing a recording.
Perfect, great. So, like we talked about earlier, what do we correlate to? That's probably the biggest question on everyone's mind as they get ready for marketing your programs and letting teachers know what you can help them achieve. And I think probably most likely you are still going to be correlating to the grade level expectation. That's probably the easiest place to correlate. But I also think there's room. You might have a program that really effectively incorporates a science and engineering practice, and that might be helpful to provide maybe in your description of the program what skills you're engaging in that program, or what cross-cutting concepts you're looking at. So that may be ways to incorporate that, to change your language a little bit so you're speaking the same language that teachers are asked to be looking at, even though you're correlating still to that grade level expectation. And again, every district is a little bit different and does things a little bit different. So it's worth having a conversation with some of the teachers you work with regularly to see what's most helpful to them when they're transitioning into these new standards. So let's talk about where we find water in the standards. And before I dive into this, I will give a little caveat in that this is my first take at this in exploring the standards and where water occurs. So I may have missed things, or there may be other connections that could be made. So this is just kind of a general overview of where we saw water. But in the early grades, you're going to see it in a couple of places. One is in looking at physical properties of things and physical properties of matter, liquid, solids, steam, those types of things, those types of activities are happening in the early grades. You're also going to see repeated across grades ideas around living things having basic needs, which includes water and how they get water in their environments. And the concepts, this is kind of an abbreviation of what's in there. So the concepts definitely get bigger as the grades go on, and have a little more information in them, but you'll see that occur throughout. You'll also see weather occurring for the first time in kindergarten, and I think it's exciting to note that there's actually a part in the weather grade level expectation that relates to how humans impact the environment. And you're going to see that throughout the grades, a lot more emphasis on what is our relationship with the environment. I think the other big water standard happens in second grade, and that's where we start the concept of wind and water can change the shape of land. As we move into upper elementary grades, third, fourth, and fifth, and I know there's a lot of information on this slide, so I tried to highlight the key points here. You're going to start seeing standards around how the environment affects how an organism develops. So you think about things like, how does that change a plant's development if it doesn't have access to, if it's in a drought condition, things like that. Third grade is where climate appears for the first time, and there's a pretty heavy emphasis on climate and weather conditions. You're also going to see a pretty strong emphasis throughout the standards on weather-related hazards and natural hazards. So think about things like droughts and floods as related to water. And you're going to see that increase across the grades. It's a repeated concept. And they also talk about how humans can reduce the impacts of those types of scenarios. You're going to see several standards that starts in fourth grade about how major Earth systems interact. So we're talking there about the geosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and atmosphere, and how those systems interact. So that obviously has a lot of connections to water. You're going to continue to see the living things and their needs occur. And in fifth grade is where you start to see some of the standards about where water is on the planet and where most of Earth's water is contained. And you also have an emphasis on what human activities have major effects on those systems. As that continues into middle school, you're going to see water occur multiple times in the science standards, and that starts to talk about human-environment interactions and environmental interactions between living and non-living things is a big emphasis in middle school. And I should also note that middle school is one of the bigger changes we saw. So in the previous standards, it was delineated grade by grade. There were sixth grade standards, seventh grade standards, and eighth grade standards. Now they're just in one big bucket, and schools have the opportunity to kind of decide where this content gets taught. So again, that's something you're going to want to reach out to districts if you do middle school programming to see where they're putting these things, because they have control over that. Water cycles also occurs for the first time in middle school, where you're going to see that. Again, deepening the complexity of weather patterns and how that influences climate, how humans depend on Earth's resources, deepening concepts with natural hazards, human activities, and how human activities affect global warming. In high school, you're going to see much of the same things, again, just with deepening of the content that they're covering. But they're basically the same ideas that we looked at in middle school. Organisms interact with their living and non-living components. Environment influences survival, human interactions, how Earth systems cause feedback effects, and those are the examples they give in that standard are things like volcanic eruptions and what are the feedback effects from that, or an ice age, what are the feedback effects from that. Focusing on water's unique chemical and physical properties, global climate systems, resource availability, again, natural hazards. Here in high school, you actually get into how do we responsibly manage natural resources. and then again with a global climate model. So I think there's a lot of really great content to explore, and especially the climate change information in the standards and the human environment interactions is much stronger than I think we saw it in the last set of standards, so that's exciting. Geography is another place where you're going to see a lot of connections to water, although I would say they're less explicit. Geography breaks, almost every grade has 2 grade level expectations within it. One is related to geographic tools, and the other is related to human and environment interactions. And so you're going to see a lot about natural resources and how humans interact with them. It doesn't necessarily call out water, but you could apply water pretty much throughout the grade levels at different scales. Kindergarten starts much closer to home and family. 4th grade remains kind of that Colorado history piece, and it increases to where you're talking about global issues at the high school level. So this is another really great place to look. And I would say there are great connections throughout the social studies. Also, if you're looking at historical uses of water, there's some connections in history. Economics, you can make some really great connections. And of course, civics, in terms of taking personal action, there's some great connections there as well that you can definitely think about in terms of how you correlate your program. Other helpful standards that you might want to look at, reading, writing, and communicating. One thing that is outlined in environmental education national standards is that an important part of investigating environmental issues is actually taking a personal opinion or a personal viewpoint on something and kind of understanding and reflecting about what that is. That's something you're not going to see come up explicitly in the science or the social studies standards. But if you go to reading, writing, and communicating, it does ask students to take a position on something. So if you are investigating environmental issues in any of the work that you're doing, this could be a good place to look for connections. And I think for many teachers, that's a great plus when they're able to connect to language arts standards. So that's definitely a place to look. And then in math, anytime you're collecting data on anything, I think, what comes to mind for me is like macroinvertebrate testing and studies that you might do with learners. If you're collecting data and analyzing it, standard 3 in math, and you'll have to look at the specific grade that you're looking at, but that data analysis, statistics, and probability is a great place to look if you're doing any type of data collection with the work that you're doing. So one thing I wanted to talk about briefly is there's a lot of great stuff in the standards, but there are some things that are missing, and I think they continue to get better and better as we revise them. But as environmental educators and water educators, there may be a few things that we want to pay close attention to. And so when we look at our national standards and how do we graduate environmentally literate students by the end of 12th grade, we're looking at 4 different buckets of information. One is those questioning, analysis, and interpretation skills, which is going to relate super strongly back to the science and engineering practices and the Colorado essential skills. So you're going to see great connections there. The strand 2 that we're talking about is knowledge of environmental processes and systems, and this includes natural systems and social systems. So you're going to see that a lot in science and social studies. 3 is skills for analyzing and investigating environmental issues. And then 4 is personal and civic responsibility. So NAAE went through and correlated those national environmental education standards to the next generation science standards. And you will see the darker boxes mean it's stronger and the lighter boxes mean it's weaker. So you will see those skills show up super strongly in strand 1. The content shows up pretty strongly in strand 2, but where we still have some major gaps is in how to investigate environmental issues and in personal and civic responsibility. So just because that isn't in the standards doesn't mean we can't incorporate it into our programming, and that's, I think, something that's important to think about. Like I said, most of the science and engineering practices line up super well with what we're doing in environmental education and what we want to accomplish. The only one that I think is a little weak is using math and computational thinking. We don't see strong connections to that, although you definitely can do it and make some strong connections there. In social studies, and I will say this was me going through the social studies standards, so again, I could have missed something. And I went through the grade level expectations. I did not dig really deep into all of the content in the standards, so we might see more that might not visibly appear in those grade level expectations. But similar results. I think strand 1, those skills that we're looking at in environmental education show up really strongly in both history and geography. 2.1 and 2.2, if you look at those strands, those are natural concepts, so we would expect not much to show up there. That all shows up in the science standards. 2.3 and 2.4, which are looking at our social systems and how humans interact with the environment, how economics plays a part, how government plays a part, all of those social systems in anything we're talking about in the environment, that shows up really strongly in geography. Again, you're gonna see it's a little bit weaker on the investigating environmental issues, and the personal and civic responsibility definitely shows up in the civics, obviously, but it's not explicit to environmental education, so you have to kind of make that connection. The reason I think that's really important to share and talk about is because a couple of years ago, a study came out. It was the National Environmental Literacy Assessment, and they actually tested students in middle school to see how environmentally literate they were. And they did 2 rounds of that study. The first round, they saw, they tested random schools and looked at how environmentally literate those students were. And you can imagine what the results of that were, not great. But the second round, they picked high quality environmental education programming and tested students on their environmental literacy to see if that programming was really making a difference. And what they found was ecological knowledge was up, environmental sensitivity was up, commitment was up, intended action was up. All of those things were much stronger because they were participating in environmental education programming. However, failing grades across the board in investigating environmental issues and how to understand environmental issues. And I think as a field, both in water education and all types of environmental education, that's something we need to pay attention to. Those are important skills that students need to have in terms of thinking about how to investigate and break down an environmental issue. So if there are ways to incorporate that into your programming, I think that's important. I will break there. Are there some questions?
Yeah, so Katie, one question that we got is that someone just commented that they had heard that an advised entry point is the SEPs. Can you comment or react to that?
The SEPs. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that acronym. If you could type that in, that would be great. And while you're typing that in, was there another question?
Yeah, so the other one I think really goes along with what you were talking about in the last few slides, that not all science educators think that these standards are done in a way that makes sense and as scientists, we can influence and explain why, as EE, we decide to put some concepts forward. And so if it makes sense, we don't have to be limited by these standards.
Absolutely. I think it's important to meet the needs of your audience, and your audience, obviously, if you're working with K through 12 learners, they want students to understand and master these competencies. But if we can go beyond that, I think that's really important and a great comment.
And one last comment. Someone suggested maybe we could emphasize through communication with teachers and districts about what are the most challenging standards to meet due to budget issues and purchasing materials.
Oh, that's a great comment, and important to share. And I think as folks learn that information, send it my way, and I'm happy to share it back out with the group. As you're talking to districts about what that looks like, that's great information to share. Absolutely. So let me share with you a couple of tools that you can use right now, and I would anticipate that the number of tools that exist will grow as we get farther into the transition process. I know when we last adopted standards in 2009, throughout those 2 years where the districts were transitioning to using them, periodically new tools were released. So we'll try to share those as we learn about them and as they come out. What they do have already up on the Colorado Department of Education's website is both downloadable standards that you can take and download, or an online searchable database. So you can enter in the content area, the grade level, and the standard category, and it will search for you and pull out those things, and you can enter multiple searches in the same list so that you can pull those out together. So as you're sorting through, this makes it a little less overwhelming if you can look at the subset that you need to look at rather than tackling the whole document at once. So this is a great tool to check out. Another tool that's out there is the NAAE has done correlations with both the Common Core standards and NGSS. So if you know what you're trying to reach in terms of environmental education, you can quickly look and see how that aligns with what standards you might be looking at, whether that's Common Core or whether that's the next generation science standards, and you can get kind of a quick correlation without having to dig through the whole document. They also have linkages to the National Social Studies standards, the C3 College, Career, and Civic Life Framework. That was not as heavily integrated into Colorado standards, so there might not be quite as many direct connections there, but that is available as well. Another resource that I would recommend is the Beatles Project. And Beatles is out of the Lawrence Hall of Science, and it consists of both some training modules for non-formal environmental educators, as well as student activities. And there are probably 30+ different student activities, and then a handful of different practices that educators can engage in that really align with the next generation science standards. And this was set up specifically to really utilize the next generation standards and demonstrate strong teaching in the next generation science standards. So if you're looking for an example of what that looks like, this is a great place to go. So when I talk about some of those practices, this is what I'm talking about. They have different protocols and activity structures for how do you help students build evidence and explanations? How do you field journal with students? How do you build skills in making observations? Work on some of those nature and practices of science, promoting discussion, questioning strategies, teaching and learning. So really great resources available on their website. So let's take a look at one of the student activities that they have listed there. This is something you can download for free and check out. There's a lesson plan called Stream Detective, and the goals and objectives of that lesson are to map a section of a stream, including speed and direction of currents, make explanations about how currents and streams form, learn that larger sediments are evidence of faster currents, think about how water moves, and use a key practice interpreting stream evidence to make explanations about what the stream was doing in the past. So you probably recognize a lot of the language that we were using above within those objectives. So when they correlate, this is what it looks like. They actually broke it down by that framework, and this is how they correlated to the next generation science standards. They listed out what the featured practice of this lesson is, that science and engineering practice, which is constructing explanations in this case. They looked at what cross-cutting concepts they're going to explore, cause and effect, and then they looked at those disciplinary core ideas. What's the content piece that we're getting to? So this is one way, one example of how they did their correlation. And you can see when we look at this quick breakdown, and obviously you would have to look at the lesson, which I can include a link to in our follow-up email to get the full idea, but you can get a quick glimpse of how they structure that. And they start out the lesson in thinking about streams and direct open exploration. They're just letting students explore, write down their observations. That's what they call an invitation to learning. Then students move into exploring currents and what those stream features are. They call that the exploration stage. Third, they get to this section of the lesson where they actually start discussing the content. So this is after they've done all of this exploration. Then they start discussing and trying to explain currents and sediment size. And that's what they're calling concept invention. And then they're going to apply that knowledge. So they're going to do more exploration, more evidence building, and explain what they find by being stream detectives and doing another activity to collect that evidence, and then a reflection piece. So you can see how they kind of flipped that traditional teaching model to really think about how to let students explore and explain first before presenting that content. And again, I will send out the link to this activity so that you can get a good look at it and really see kind of what that looks like in practice. The last tool that I want to talk about is not finished yet, but it is coming soon, I would say. We'll be working on it in 2019. So as part of the Colorado Environmental Education Plan, there is an appendix in there that takes a subset and pulls out all of the standards that are related to environmental education and puts them in one place. So you don't have to look through science and social studies and reading, writing, and communicating to find it. It makes it a smaller subset of a list. And so in 2019, we will be working to update that list with the new standards and have that available, hopefully in the fall of 2019, as some of these changes and school districts are getting a little bit farther along in their progress. So know that that's coming soon. And if you're interested in helping with that, shoot me an email and let me know, because we'll definitely be looking at more eyes and volunteers to help do that. All right, any questions that have popped up in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, we've been getting some great questions, Katie, so let me pass a few of these your way.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that we got is whether any of the content surrounding human impacts on the environment and the human-environmental interaction is being sourced from Leave No Trace education.
That's a great question, and what I would say is the standards themselves are end outcomes. They're not curriculum, they're not how to teach it. They're just at the end of the day, this is where we want to get. So probably not. However, it sounds like Leave No Trace would be a great tool to use to develop mastery of those specific standards.
Very cool. Another question was, businesses are increasingly embracing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and might these be appropriate to include or mention at that high school level?
I think absolutely, and I think you can find a lot of connections to what the standards list and what is in those sustainable development goals. And so I think at the high school level, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So we also had a question from someone who identified themselves as a water professional, and they said in addition to exposing students to the concepts, they were interested in more applied skills and really connecting students to the workplace, figuring out how to increase exposure to actual practitioners through some kind of apprentice track education, especially for older students. They also mentioned getting input from practitioners on tools, data, projects, and problems in an ongoing way would be great.
Yeah, that all sounds amazing. I think, so two things I'll throw out, and feel free to email and we can talk more about that. One, I think if you look back to those Colorado essential skills, that's where you're going to see some really strong connections to all the things that you're talking about. And so as you're working with schools and teachers to set up some of those opportunities, some of those language from that Colorado essential skills would be a great place to make those connections. Second, you might also check out the Natural Resource Careers Initiative, which is an initiative to promote pathways for youth into natural resource careers. And that's a network of all kinds of folks who have a similar goal. And so there might be some shared resources and things you can look at there as well.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm just going to check our questions log to see if there were any more coming through. We had an earlier question that's backtracking a little, but we missed it on the strands that you presented from EE. Mm-hmm. We were asked to elaborate on the strands and explain what ES6, ES12, ES7 means. Do you want me to go back to that slide?
Sure. So that sounds like you're talking about the elaborating on the GLE. And so those are the codings that they use to connect. So specifically looking here, so you'll see under elaboration of the GLE on that right-hand side, number 2, you'll see ESS2. And I don't know the coding super well, but what I'm guessing from what I know is that is Earth and Space Science Standard 2. And so in the NGSS standards, that's how they code it. That's so you can find it in the NGSS standards and know exactly where it fits or where they pulled it from. But they put the text right there so you know what that piece of content is. So in order to, for students to master wind and water change the shape of the land, they need to understand content around earth materials and systems, and they need to understand content around plate tectonics and large-scale system interactions, and they would probably need to understand and explore content around the roles of water in earth surface processes. So hopefully that makes sense, but those codings just allow you to find it in NGSS. So earth science, life science would be LS, physical science would be PS, is what that stands for.
All right, well, we are almost out of time, so I'm just going to jump to the end here. We had a couple of announcements that we wanted to mention from each of our organizations. We do have a couple of upcoming offerings for our Water Educator Network here at WECO. If you are someone who's involved in Water Festival coordination, we'd love to have you join us for our annual Water Festival Coordinators Gathering on February 7th. We have not solidified a location for that, but it will be most of the day. It's a great event. We bring together 24 coordinators to exchange ideas and do a training. We'll also be hosting a Project WET training later this spring and a Water Educator Network Symposium, so stay tuned for details on that. You can always check back on our website, and I've put the URL here.
And for CAE tries to do a webinar each month, and in January we're going to be doing Certification 101, which is how you can become a certified environmental educator. So if you are interested in that, please stay tuned for details. And then also our Advancing Environmental Education Conference is coming up on March 15th through the 16th of 2019, and scholarship applications are open right now and will be open through January. So check that out if you're interested. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to grab these questions and see if there were any we didn't get to, and we'll send those out in a follow-up email, as well as the PowerPoint and some of the links we mentioned. We will send those out to you as well. So stay tuned for that. And thanks so much for joining us on this Thursday afternoon. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.